Hey everyone, one of the most concerning elements of mountaineering for me is the fact that even high-level professional climbers have died in the mountains. Because of this, I wanted to research 5 deaths on Mount Everest involving very skilled mountaineers to better understand what events unfolded that led to their death in hopes to prepare myself for future climbing endeavors and maybe even yours as well. I want to start off with Thomas Olsson, who is without a doubt one of the most talented climbers I've researched here. Olsson was born in Sweden, and as you may expect, he found a passion for skiing and climbing at a very young age. With these two passions, he combined them and climbed and skied down many of the 7 summits, including Aconcagua, which is the highest point in South America. His most notable ski descent at this point was down Choyo-Yu, which is an 8,000 meter peak bordering Nepal, meaning he had gotten a ton of experience at such high altitudes and even in the death zone. Now, from what I've read, Olsson had already climbed Everest, but he wanted to push the limits even further. So at the age of 30 in 2006, Olsson went to his boy Tormod Granheim, and they discussed making a world's first ski descent down an extremely steep, dangerous, and never before done route on Everest. So if you didn't know, there's 2 main routes on Everest, the North and the South Col. The majority of climbers either take one of these because they're the most commercialized and the most safe. All of my footage from my Everest expedition was on the south side, but Olsson's was going to be taking place on the north. Normally on the north, climbers will ascend from Everest Base Camp to Advanced Base Camp at 20,800 feet, and this is where the real climb begins. From there, climbers will go to the North Col, then move up to Camp 2 and Camp 3, where they will push for the summits. Usually after summiting, climbers will go down the same route they came up, but Olsson and Granheim had a different plan in mind. They wanted to take the normal north route up, but ski down the Norten Couloir on the north face after summiting, which had never been done before. With these high ambitions and both of their extensive experience, it was no surprise that they had successfully moved from Advanced Base Camp up to the summit. In fact, they had only done it in 2 days, which it would usually take 5 days for the average climber. So that just shows how experienced and fit they were. So now we're at the summit, and there's a few issues going on that we need to talk about before their descent. The first one was that wherever they had set up their high camp, it had taken 14 hours to go from there to the summit, which, as you can imagine, in the death zone is going to be pretty tiring. The second issue was that they reported they were also fighting a snowstorm to the summit. These guys are insane, but they probably were cold, high winds, and, they were not feeling the mountain anymore. I'm sure they wanted to get off of this thing. So they began their ascent into the Norten Couloir, territory which had never been skied down by anyone in history. Around 1,000 feet down the extremely steep, 60-degree slopes, part of Olsson's ski had broken behind the bindings. This delayed the two of them heavily as they scrambled to try and fix the ski with some leftover climbing gear and duct tape, which normally solves all problems, but maybe not here. Then, with a slightly broken ski, they continued down until they reached this point here. Now, there isn't a ton of information containing details about where the following events took place, but it is stated that they were about 1,500 feet below the summit when they were met with a 150-foot vertical rock face, which I believe to be this point here. As you can see, they cannot move to the left as there is a mega face, and then to the right, there's not much to work with either. Going back up to the normal route isn't really an option either, since they're probably extremely weak after already being out for 16 plus hours, so they gotta get down this drop somehow. Because they cannot ski down it, they attempted to build an anchor, which for those who don't know, you're basically just finding something to attach to the mountain, attaching your rope to that thing, and then rappelling off of it so you can get down faces like this safely. The issue was there was no good rock to build an anchor inside of, so they went ahead and made a makeshift one in the snow using an ice axe and 2 snow pickets. Olsson went first and rappelled down using the makeshift anchor. All seemed to be going okay at first, but just a couple dozen feet down, the anchor would end up failing, causing Olsson to drop a couple more dozen feet down onto the snow below. Here, he was knocked unconscious and tragically slid thousands of feet more to his death. Olsson's partner, Granheim, didn't see the fall, but he had known it had happened. It was foggy out, obviously he can't use the anchor anymore, so he decided to free climb down the mountain himself until he reached snow and finish off the ski descent on his own. After looking into Olsson and Granheim's plan and the events that led to his death, this is what I took away from the whole situation. These 2 climbers were extremely experienced and did everything right, but the one thing that I think about a lot was the decision to rappel off of an anchor they might have not been sure about, versus just free climbing down initially, as these were really their only two options. As we know from Granheim's descent after Olsen's fall, it was possible to free climb down the vertical rock face, even though it might have seemed very dangerous in the moment. I imagine the reason they had decided to trust this anchor instead of free climbing down immediately was because they had been out for so long, 16 hours in the death zone. They're probably so tired at this point it really wasn't worth trying to test their abilities on such a down climb. Regardless, Olsen and Granheim were both extremely talented and skilled mountaineers that deserve a ton of respect for their feats. And while it may be hard to take a direct lesson from their situation, David Sharp's final climb gives us a lot more insight. David Sharp was a 34-year-old London man who in 2006 was going for his third Everest attempt after being unsuccessful the first two times. He also had attempts on Choyoyu and Dhaulagiri, but neither of these were successful. These prior expeditions show his experience on 8,000-meter peaks, but also the ability to turn around in face of defeat, which is a very key trait to have. The biggest thing to note about these previous climbs were that the majority of them were abandoned due to cold or frostbite, one of which he had even lost some of his toes on. Even Richard Duggan, who led his Choyoyu expedition, said that he was a strong climber but was tall and skinny, possessed very little body fat, which is crucial to staying warm at high altitudes. With this context and past experience in mind, let's jump into David Sharp's 2006 Everest expedition plans. Unlike his previous two attempts, David wanted to climb Everest from the north route, but this time no oxygen and no Sherpa support. At this point in time, that had been done many times, so it was in the realm of possibilities and he had a shot at doing it. So he began his way from Advanced Base Camp to the summits. On the 13th of May, he had successfully moved himself up to a high camp, most likely around Camp 3 at 27,300 feet. His plan was to push up to the summit that evening, so he was projected to summit without oxygen and without Sherpa support on the 14th. The biggest issue was, according to Jamie McGinnis, who is a friend of David's and also an expedition leader himself, said that the days David was up in the high camps was some of the coldest days of the entire year. He even said that it was savagely cold. That's not a good thing to hear. Even with this, David pushed up, and because he was alone, the events that occurred in between his departure and death are fairly unknown. Many say that he had not made the summit, but Jamie McGinnis says that he had made the summit and believes that. So for the sake of the video, let's just say he did in fact summit on the 14th at 4 p.m. From the summit, David would attempt to make his way back down, but around the Northeast Ridge second step, which is just at around 28,000 feet, he would crawl for shelter inside of Green Boots Cave. Several climbers would pass by on their way to the summit, and some even reported that David Sharp had waved them along. But unfortunately, after the hours went on, he would lose all mobility inside of the cave and tragically pass inside of it. My main takeaway was that David had a well-known susceptibility to the cold, and he had ended up making his summit push without oxygen and without Sherpa support during one of the coldest times of the entire season. When in the death zone without oxygen, your body is going to be a lot more cold because one, oxygen and blood flow warms your body up. Both these are going to slow down up there. You're running out of calories, which is going to cause you to lose energy, and you might just crawl into a cave to rest like he did. While it might be okay to summit at 4 p.m. with a Sherpa support team or just a team in general and with oxygen, if you don't have either of those, and the sun is going down, it's getting very cold, and you already know you get cold easily, then that is not a good situation to be in. Therefore, knowing your own weaknesses when you go into extreme environments like this is a must. You have to know what to look out for, what to prepare for, so if it gets too bad, you know you have to turn back because this certain thing gets me. And that's going to save your life. Personally, most of my body runs really, really hot, but my hands run really, really cold. So when I go up into these conditions, I always make sure that my hands are a little bit warmer, I don't get frostbite, but my body is a little bit lighter. Now, both of these instances involving Olsen and Sharp had occurred on the north side, but I thought it'd be interesting to look at Nobukazu Kariki's case, which occurred on the south side, as I had also climbed from this route. Nobukazu Kariki had gained a ton of 8,000 meter peak experience in his life. All without oxygen, he had done Choyoyu, Dhaulagiri, Manaslu, and Broad Peak. Prior to 2018, he had attempted to climb Everest 7 times. One expedition, in his most recent before his final one, he lost 9 of his fingers. Even with these past experiences, Nobukazu didn't want to stop there and wanted to continue his journey to the top of the world. In 2018, Kariki was planning on making an ascent up the standard South Col route by himself and without oxygen. Once again, an extraordinary feat. Now, I do believe he was capable of doing this because of his prior 8,000 meter peak experiences, but unfortunately, things started to go wrong immediately as he entered base camp. He had fallen ill, developed a fever, and a really bad cough, and base camp, being 18,000 feet in elevation, was going to make it very hard for his body to recover naturally. Over the next couple days, he would document his entire recovery on his blog, and soon he said that he was feeling better and was going to continue his ascent up Mount Everest without oxygen and without Sherpa support. The main issue was that even though he said he was feeling better, many people reported that they had seen him with a cough, meaning he probably wasn't 100% recovered yet. As he continued up the mountain, he walkie-talkied saying that he was going to be very careful, but upon arriving at Camp 3, which is around 23,000 feet, his health had degraded so much that he decided to turn back. Unfortunately, while moving down the Lhotse face, which is a relatively dangerous part of the climb, he would end up falling around 500 feet to his death in the Western Coombe, most likely due to severe fatigue from his ongoing illness. When you're at high altitude, your body does not heal as properly and as fast, whether it's be a cut or your immune system. When I was moving up for my summit rotation, after leaving base camp and going to Camp 2, I came down with literally just a slight illness, which would have been nothing. It was like a cough, nothing at sea level, but that move day was the worst day of my life. And that's not even an exaggeration. I felt like I was gonna throw up every 3 steps. Fortunately for me, after a couple days of resting at Camp 2, I had made a recovery and somehow was able to make it up the entire mountain. But in Kariki's case, his conditions had gotten so bad that it became very dangerous to make a descent from Camp 3. This is why you have to always be willing to drop such an expedition, especially at high altitude, at the slight signal of an illness, because you're not going to recover as you go up the mountain. Unfortunately, it's always going to be hard to predict how your body will react to a certain environment. You might think that you'll get better, you might get worse, so it's usually just best to play it extremely safe and try again when you're feeling better and more confident. Now in Sharp and Kariki's case, it was more so a matter of physical conditions that would lead to their deaths, but I also wanted to look into more deaths involving technical failure like we saw with Olsen and his snow anchor. Marty Hoey was an extremely experienced mountaineer who had summited Rainier over 100 times and had also led expeditions on Denali in Alaska. She had also done all of this in the early 80s and late 70s, which is seen as just a much more self-sufficient and less resourceful time of mountaineering, so that just goes to show her skill. Lou Whitaker, another extremely experienced and established mountaineer, put together an Everest expedition in 1982 and invited Marty to join. They would take the standard North Col route, and if Marty did summit, she would become the first American woman to make it to the top. As the 1982 climbing season embarked, the team would make their way up and down the mountain, acclimatizing and preparing themselves for their summit push. On May 15th, Marty and her teammates Jim Wickwire were both moving up the fixed lines next to each other on a 40-degree slope. They were around 26,500 feet up on the northeast ridge, trying to get to Camp 6, where they would likely depart from for the summit in the following days. We can assume that Jim Wickwire was moving faster than Marty, so he needed to pass her. But when Marty leaned to the side for him to clip around her, her harness came undone, which led to her unexpectedly sliding thousands of feet off the mountain into a crevasse below. For those unaware, when moving up fixed lines, you are attached to a rope with your harness, and that rope is attached to the mountain. So as long as your harness is connecting you to the rope and the rope is attached to the mountain, if you fall, you're going to be stopped by the rope. But if your harness comes undone, there will be nothing to stop you from falling. While it's hard to say what caused the harness to unbuckle, it's safe to assume that it just wasn't fastened safely to begin with or hadn't been double checked. They were in the death zone, and at such high altitudes, your brain is just not working as well. Things can easily slip your mind, and especially if you didn't expect anything to go wrong in the first place. This is a pretty compelling reminder that no matter how confident you are, no matter what peaks you've climbed in the past, you always have to double check every single piece of gear every anchor, your harness crampons to make sure that they are completely safe. Not only that, but if you're climbing with someone else, you should always check each other's gear. It'll only take 5 seconds. Now, while researching all of these incidents, I think the biggest shock to the climbing world was the death of Uli Stek because of how professional and skilled he was. Uli Stek was born in Sweden and had become an extremely experienced alpinist in his teenage years. He had made world record ascents on the north face of the Eiger, Matterhorn. He was incredibly experienced. There's documentaries on him out there everywhere. He had also made the first solo ascent of Annapurna's south face, which is also an 8,000 meter peak, meaning he went in the death zone. In fact, people even called him the Swiss machine because they never saw him slow down on the routes. All of that brings us to 2017, where Uli Stek planned to do another world's first. Along with Tenji Sherpa, he would ascend the west ridge of Everest, which is rarely ever done. Then he would summit Everest and traverse over to the summit of Lhotse, all without oxygen. This was an extremely ambitious goal, but with his prior experience and track record, he was more than capable of making it happen. Unfortunately, while Tenji Sherpa and Stek were preparing and acclimatizing, Tenji came down with a bad case of frostbite and would likely have to wait a couple weeks for it to heal. Instead of waiting with Tenji in base camp, Uli went back up to the mountain to Camp 2 alone to look for other ways to continue preparing his body. Now, usually, and what I did on my expedition, is most climbers will move from Camp 2 to Camp 3 or 4, then come all the way back down in order to acclimatize their body before they make a push for the summit. But rather than doing this traditional acclimatization procedure, Uli decided last minute that he wanted to prepare for Everest and Lhotse by climbing a nearby peak called Nuptse. Nuptse is a 25,700 foot mountain right next to Everest. I mean, it's practically a part of it, so you can see they're connected. While it is shorter than Everest and Lhotse by a couple thousand feet, every single person, and I mean every single person, that has climbed Nuptse said it was harder than Everest and Lhotse. One person on my team last year even said that Nuptse Summit Day is harder than K2 Summit Day, and that's just because of how steep, technical, and long it can be. Uli definitely knew this, and with his past experience, he could very well pull it off to prepare for his world record traverse in the next few days. So he went and texted Tenji that he would be climbing it. Tenji then asked if he would be doing it alone or with friends, but received no response from Uli. We could assume that Uli then moved from Camp 2 to Nuptse High Camp, and then pushed for Nuptse Summit on April 30th. He was spotted moving up the face by some other climbers who were far away, but about 1,000 feet or so below the summit, he would end up falling 3,000 feet down the entire face to his death. Unfortunately, it isn't very well known exactly what caused him to fall, as he was alone and hadn't been keeping in touch that whole day. Now, it's pretty easy to make the takeaway of this incident that you shouldn't climb alone or without protection, but that's pretty shallow, especially considering we don't know what caused him to fall. After asking Alan Arnett, he believes that Uli might have went and grabbed a rock and it simply just gave away and caused him to fall. But there is also the possibility that the climb was just so unexpectedly strenuous that it fatigued his legs so much that he was more at risk of falling. Like I said, Nuptse is an incredibly hard mountain to climb, and because of Uli's going on a whim approach to it and not responding to Tenji's text, I assume there might have been a little bit of an underestimation of the mountain there. This is just one possibility I've ruled out, and it could very well not be the case, but it can serve as a reminder to never ever underestimate the mountain and its unknown possibilities, because that's going to lead to your downfall. The more of these unknowns you mitigate and make yourself cautious of is always going to increase your chances of survival in the mountains. All in all, these were incredibly talented, skilled, and inspiring climbers, and hopefully you found their cases as insightful as I did. If you found the video interesting, subscribe, as I post a lot more mountaineering content, and yeah, thanks for watching.